Every man in Wyoming territory knew the name Martha Hale, and every one of them feared her. They called her the Ox of Redstone Ridge. They said it in whispers, in smoky saloons and behind dusty general store counters. Never to her face. They said she was too strong, too big, too much woman for any man to handle. Her hands, they said, could snap a man's spine like a dry twig. Her voice could curdle milk from a mile away. She'd heard it all. She let them talk. Words were just wind, and the wind on her ridge was a constant scream. Inside her cabin, the only sound was the hiss and crackle of the fire. It threw dancing shadows on the log walls, long and twisted like the lies the townsfolk told. Martha sat in her heavy rocker, her thick dark braid slung over one shoulder. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even. She was the picture of a woman exhausted, finally at rest. But Martha wasn't sleeping. She was hunting. Across the room, a man knelt by the hearth, Thomas Dwyer. He'd been on her ranch for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, he'd said maybe 100 words. He'd arrived with dust on his boots and a shadow in his eyes, stuttering his own name so softly she thought the wind might carry it away. He was different. The last hired hand, a barrel-chested loudmouth named Jeb, lasted 2 days. He'd watched her single-handedly lift the back end of a wagon out of the mud, and the next morning his bunk was empty. The one before that tried to put a hand on her waist after a few swigs of corn liquor. He left with a broken wrist and a new understanding of the word no. But Thomas didn't flinch. He just watched. When she'd split an old pine stump clean in two with one swing of the axe, he hadn't stared with wide-eyed fear like the others. He'd just looked down at his own hands, a faint blush creeping up his neck, and then quietly offered to split the rest of the pile. He never met her gaze for more than a second. If their hands brushed while passing a bucket, he'd jump back like he'd touched a hot coal. He treated her like she was either a saint or a phantom, and Martha was damn tired of not knowing which. So tonight, she was laying a trap. After a silent supper of rabbit stew and hard bread, she'd settled into her rocker. She let her head loll to the side, let one arm dangle limp over the edge. Her breathing was a slow, deep rhythm. A perfect performance. She wanted to see what kind of man he was when the giant wasn't watching. Would he rifle through her ledger? Steal the silver locket her mother left her? Or would he just sit there, as quiet and useless as a stone? She listened. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and then a new sound. The soft scrape of a chair leg on the floorboards. He was moving. Martha held her breath, peering through the tiny slit between her eyelids. She saw him rise, his movements careful, deliberate. He wasn't moving toward her desk. He wasn't moving toward the locked chest where she kept her money. He was moving toward the kitchen shelf. He picked something up, a small, round tin. It was wrapped in a piece of old linen. He walked back toward the fire, his steps so quiet they were barely there. He knelt, not by the coals, but beside her chair. Her heart started to pound, a low, heavy drum against her ribs. He unwrapped the linen. The tin gleamed in the firelight. It was her salve, her mother's recipe of beeswax and chamomile, for hands that worked too hard. She'd forgotten all about it. He opened the lid with a gentle twist, the scent of pine and herbs filling the small space between them. And then he took her hand, the hand that had hauled logs, gutted deer, and buried her own husband. The hand covered in calluses thicker than boot leather. He held it like it was made of spun glass. He dipped his fingers into the salve and began to massage it into her palm. His touch was slow, firm, rubbing circles into the hardened skin, working the ointment into every crack and groove. It wasn't the touch of a man seeking pleasure. It was the touch of a man tending to something precious. Martha's throat went tight. Her lungs forgot how to work. Then he did something that shattered the frozen stillness inside her. He lifted her hand to his lips, and pressed a soft, reverent kiss into the center of her palm, a single tear of warmth against her calloused skin. "You don't even know," he whispered, his voice a broken rasp, barely louder than the fire. "You don't even know how graceful you are." Martha did not move. She couldn't. "Like the wind that bends the prairie grass," he murmured, his breath warm on her skin, "but never, ever breaks it." He kept speaking, his voice trembling, not to her, but to the woman he thought was sleeping. "I see you. Not what they say. Not the ox. I see the woman who keeps this whole damn mountain alive with her hands. The one who buried her husband all alone and never shed a tear where anyone could see. The one who just keeps going." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. 6 years. It had been 6 years since her husband James died, crushed under a faulty rig in the Blackwood mine. She hadn't cried then. Not when the foreman gave her the news with his hat in his hands and pity in his eyes. Not when she dug the grave herself in the frozen January earth because the preacher was too afraid of the cold. Not once. But now. Now, this quiet, trembling man was undoing all of it with a few whispered words. Thomas gently placed her hand back in her lap. He brushed his fingers over the back of it one last time, a feather-light touch, and then he stood. He put the lid back on the tin, set it carefully on the mantel, and walked to the door. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't grab a lantern. He just opened the door and stepped out into the screaming blackness of the storm. Martha's eyes snapped open. The warmth of his touch still lingered on her skin, but a cold dread was seeping into her bones. The wind howled like a banshee, and through it she heard another sound. A new sound. Hooves. Galloping hard and fast, not away from the ranch, but toward it. And they were getting closer. Martha was on her feet in an instant, the rocking chair still swaying behind her. The man who saw her as graceful had just walked coatless into a blizzard. And someone was riding through that same blizzard, straight for her land. These two things couldn't be a coincidence. She grabbed her heavy wool shawl from the peg by the door and threw it over her shoulders. The wind tore at the door as she pulled it open, thick, wet snow slapping her face. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white and black. She could just make out Thomas's shape, a dark figure stumbling through the paddock, heading for the barn. "Thomas!" she yelled, but the wind swallowed her voice whole. She plunged into the storm, the snow instantly soaking the hem of her dress, her boots sinking into the fast-growing drifts. By the time she reached the barn, her cheeks were raw and her lungs burned with cold air. She pushed the heavy barn door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and nervous animals. The horses stamped and whinnied in their stalls, their eyes wide and wild from the storm's fury. A single lantern cast a pool of trembling golden light in the center of the aisle. And there was Thomas. He stood beside her old mare, Daisy, his hand on the horse's neck, whispering to her. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking out the small, grimy window at the back of the barn, out toward the ridge. "I know, girl," he was saying, his voice low and steady. "I know. I get spooked, too." The door creaked shut behind Martha, and Thomas spun around, his body tensing like a cornered animal. His eyes were wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm. I thought you were sleeping," he stammered. "I was," she lied, her voice low to hide its shaking. "But you ran out without a coat, and I heard a rider." His face went pale. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking ghostly in the lantern light. He didn't deny it. He just stared at her, his jaw working silently. "Who is it, Thomas?" she asked, walking slowly toward him. The space between them felt charged, electric. "Who's coming?" He shook his head, turning away from her to look back out the window. "It's nothing, Martha. Just a traveler caught in the snow." Travelers don't ride like that, she said, stopping just behind him. They ride like they're being chased, or like they're doing the chasing. He flinched. She put a hand on his shoulder. He was trembling, not from the cold, but from something deep inside him. I heard what you said, she said softly. Back in the cabin. I saw what you did. He froze completely, his back ramrod straight. A wave of shame rolled off him, so thick she could almost taste it. I didn't mean any disrespect. Thomas. She made him turn to face her. Look at me. He slowly lifted his eyes to hers. The fear was still there, but underneath it was a well of exhaustion so deep it made her own aches feel small. No one's ever said those things to me, she said, her voice rough with emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years. No one's ever looked at me and seen that. He swallowed hard. It's the truth. Then tell me another truth, she pressed, her grip on his shoulder tightening. Who is riding to my ranch in the middle of a blizzard? He stared at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Trust, maybe. Or judgment. The barn doors rattled under a heavy gust of wind, and Daisy shied again. Thomas instinctively reached out to calm the horse without even looking. His hands were made for gentle things. They're not coming for you, he finally whispered. They're coming for me. Before Martha could ask the next question, the sound of the hooves stopped abruptly just outside the barn. A man's voice, rough as gravel, cut through the wind. Dwyer, I know you're in there. Silas Blackwood sends his regards. Thomas's eyes shut. A look of pure despair washed over his face. Silas Blackwood. The name hit Martha like a physical blow. The owner of the mine where her husband had died. The richest, most powerful, and most ruthless man in the territory. A man who owned everything, including the law. What does he want with you? She demanded, her voice a low growl. Thomas finally looked at her, his expression grim. He thinks I stole something from him. Did you? A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. I stole his daughter's heart. The barn door crashed open, slamming against the inside wall. Two men stood silhouetted against the swirling snow, long dusters covering their frames, shotguns held loosely in their hands. They weren't lawmen. They were Blackwood's enforcers, hired muscle known for their cruelty. The taller one, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, smirked. Well, look what we have here. The little thief found himself a place to hide, and a big one at that. He let his gaze crawl over Martha, dripping with insolence. Blackwood wants you back, Dwyer. Seems his little girl is refusing to eat until you're brought to justice. The only justice she needs is to be away from him, Thomas said, his voice quiet but steady. He stepped slightly in front of Martha, a subtle, protective gesture that made her heart ache. That ain't your decision to make, the second man grunted. You're coming with us, now. Martha took a step forward, placing herself beside Thomas. The floorboards groaned under her weight. She was a good head taller than either of the men, and broader across the shoulders. He's not going anywhere, she said, her voice as cold and hard as the frozen ground outside. This is my land, my hired hand. You have no business here. The scarred man laughed, a short, ugly sound. Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't want to get involved in this. This is Blackwood's business. Anything that happens on my land is my business, she retorted, crossing her arms over her chest. Now get out, before I make you. The man's smirk faded. He hefted his shotgun. I don't think you understand. We're not asking. Suddenly, Thomas's hand shot out and grabbed Martha's arm. Don't, he whispered urgently. Martha, please. You can't win this fight. Watch me, she growled. No, he insisted, his grip surprisingly strong. They'll kill you. They work for Blackwood. There are no rules. This isn't about strength. It's something else. He looked her in the eyes and she saw a desperate plea. "Let me go with them. It's the only way to keep you safe." The thought of this gentle man, the only man who had ever seen the woman inside the ox, being dragged away by these brutes, made something hot and furious ignite in her gut. She would burn the whole world down before she let that happen. But before she could act, the scarred man raised his shotgun, not at Thomas, but at Daisy, the old mare. "Last chance, Dwyer," he snarled. "You come with us, or the horse gets it. Then maybe we'll see about burning down this barn, with your big friend inside." Thomas went rigid. The color drained from his face. He looked from the gun to the terrified horse to Martha. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He knew she would fight, and he knew she would probably die trying. He made a choice. He slowly raised his hands. "All right," he said, his voice hollow. "All right, I'll go, just leave them alone." Martha's mouth fell open. "Thomas, no!" He turned to her, and for a fleeting second, the shy, quiet cowboy was gone. In his place was a man with a resolve as hard as iron. "It's okay, Martha," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. "This is my fight. It has been for a long time." The two men grabbed him, shoving him roughly toward the door. As they dragged him out into the storm, Thomas looked back at her over his shoulder. His eyes weren't filled with fear anymore. They were filled with a silent promise. The barn door swung shut, leaving Martha alone in the lantern light, the echo of his words hanging in the air. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her knuckles were white. He thought this was his fight alone. He was wrong. This was her ranch, her home, her man. And Silas Blackwood had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd taken something that belonged to her. She stalked out of the barn and back to the cabin, the wind and snow no longer feeling cold. All she felt was a burning, white-hot rage. Back inside, she didn't bother stoking the fire. She went straight to the heavy oak chest at the foot of her bed, the one that held her husband's things. She threw the lid open. Inside were his old clothes, a few books, his mining tools. She dug past them, her hands searching for something she hadn't touched in 6 years. Her fingers closed around cold, hard steel. She pulled it out. James's old Colt revolver, heavy, oiled, and fully loaded. She'd thought her fighting days were over. She thought she'd buried that part of herself with her husband. But Silas Blackwood had just dug it back up. She strapped the gun belt around her waist. It felt heavier than she remembered, but familiar. Necessary. Thomas had tried to protect her by surrendering, a noble, foolish gentleman's act. He didn't understand. You couldn't protect Martha Hale. You could only get out of her way. But where had they taken him? Not to the sheriff in town. The sheriff was a scared rabbit who jumped every time Blackwood cleared his throat. They would have taken him to Blackwood's own sprawling ranch, a fortress in the northern valley. A place no one went uninvited. She couldn't go in guns blazing. Not yet. She needed a plan. She needed leverage. She went back to James's chest, her mind racing. Thomas said Blackwood thought he'd stolen something. But what if the real theft was the other way around? Blackwood's mine. The place that had taken her husband. He ran it with an iron fist, cutting corners on safety, pushing his men to their limits. James had complained about it. He'd said the support beams were rotten, that the shafts were unstable. He'd said someone was going to get killed, and then he had. They'd called it a tragic accident, a cave-in. Martha had accepted it then, lost in her own grief. But now she saw the shadow of Blackwood falling over every part of her life. She rummaged through the chest again, more frantically this time. At the very bottom, beneath a false floor she'd forgotten was even there, was a small, leather-bound journal. James's journal. He'd used it to keep track of his hours, his pay. But maybe he'd written other things, too. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, cramped handwriting. She scanned past the daily entries, the notes on weather, the price of feed, and then she found it, an entry from the day before he died. October 14th. Blackwood came to the site today, told foreman to ignore safety checks on shaft 4, said the silver vein was too rich to slow down. He's falsifying the timber invoices, using green pine instead of seasoned oak for the support beams. It's not just negligence, it's murder waiting to happen. I confronted him. He told me to keep my mouth shut, or I'd be shutting it for good. I have the original invoice from the lumber yard. He doesn't know. It proves everything. Hiding it, just in case. Martha's blood ran cold. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Blackwood had killed her husband. She frantically flipped through the rest of the journal, her heart pounding in her ears. Where? Where did he hide it? Her eyes landed on the last line of the entry. The old mare knows the way. Daisy. Her mind reeled. It didn't make sense. And then it did. The old leather saddlebags on Daisy's back, the ones that had been there for years, the ones she never used, never even bothered to take off the horse. She ran back to the barn, her boots slipping in the fresh snow. The storm was finally starting to break, the wind easing its scream to a low moan. Inside, she rushed to Daisy's stall, her hands fumbling with the stiff leather buckles of the saddlebags. She reached inside one of the dusty pouches. Her fingers brushed against a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. She pulled it out and tore it open. It was an invoice. From the Red Creek lumber yard. For 10 cords of seasoned oak, delivered to the Blackwood mine. And at the bottom, a signed note from Jedediah Miller, the yard owner. Payment received in full from James Hale. But that wasn't all. Tucked inside the invoice was another piece of paper. A letter. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. Dearest Thomas, it read, my father is a monster. He found out about us. He has locked me in my room and says he will send you away forever. He claims you stole my mother's necklace, but I know the truth. He planted it in your things. He is trying to break us, but he won't. I will find a way. Do not let him scare you. Your love is the only real thing I have ever known. Yours, Elara. Elara Blackwood. It all clicked into place. Thomas hadn't just stolen her heart. He was her alibi. He was the only one who could prove her father was a liar. And James. James held the proof that Blackwood was a murderer. These two men, strangers to each other, held the keys to destroying the most powerful man in Wyoming. And now Blackwood had one of them. She had to get to the other. Old Man Miller at the lumber yard. He was a good man, but a frightened one. He'd signed this note for James. He could testify to its authenticity. Martha saddled her strongest horse, a big roan gelding named Iron. She stuffed the journal and the papers inside her coat, checked the colt at her hip, and swung herself into the saddle. She rode out not toward Blackwood's ranch, but toward the town of Redstone. It was time to stop being the ox on the ridge. It was time to be the woman who burned injustice to the ground. The ride to Redstone felt like an eternity. The dawn was breaking as she reached the edge of the sleepy town, painting the snowy landscape in shades of gray and pale pink. She didn't go to the sheriff. She went straight to the Red Creek lumber yard. Jedediah Miller was already awake, smoke curling from the chimney of his small office. He was a stooped, older man with sawdust in his beard and fear in his eyes. When he saw Martha Hale dismount in his yard, he nearly dropped his coffee pot. "Martha," he stammered. "What in God's name?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She strode into his office, pulled the invoice from her coat, and slapped it down on his desk. "You signed this for my husband, Jedediah, the day before he died." Miller stared at the paper, his face turning ashen. I don't recall." "Don't you lie to me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "James paid you for seasoned oak. Silas Blackwood used green pine. You know it. I know it. And my husband died for it." The old man sank into his chair, his hands trembling. Blackwood threatened me, Martha. He threatened my family. He said if I ever spoke of it, he'd ruin me, or worse. He took my husband, she said, leaning over the desk, her shadow falling over him. And last night, he took my hired hand, a man named Thomas Dwyer. He's holding him at his ranch. Miller looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Dwyer? The boy who worked for him last summer? The one he accused of thievery? The same one, Martha confirmed. Blackwood framed him to keep him away from his daughter, just like he killed James to cover up his own greed. She straightened up. I'm going to get Thomas back, and I'm going to make Blackwood pay for what he did to James. I need you to ride to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Give him this. She slid the journal across the desk. Tell him everything. It's the only way. Jedediah stared at the journal, then back at Martha. He saw the grief and the fury warring in her eyes. He'd lived in fear of Silas Blackwood for 6 years, but looking at the woman standing before him, he realized there was something in the world even more terrifying than Blackwood's power. A wronged woman's vengeance. He slowly nodded. I'll do it, he whispered. For James. You do that, Martha said, turning to leave. I've got a score to settle myself. She rode out of Redstone not as a victim, but as a general marching to war. The sun was climbing in the sky as she urged Iron toward the northern valley, toward Blackwood's fortress. She knew she was riding into the lion's den, but sometimes the lion finds out he's messing with a grizzly bear. Blackwood's ranch was less of a home and more of a small, fortified town. A massive main house stood on a rise, surrounded by barns, bunkhouses, and a high fence. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. It was a monument to wealth and paranoia. Martha didn't ride to the main gate. She remembered James talking about an old, forgotten supply trail that ran along the creek bed at the back of the property, a place where the fence was often down. She found it easily, a narrow track overgrown with brush. As James had predicted, a section of the fence had been washed out by the storm. She tethered Iron in a thicket of aspen trees and crept onto the property on foot. She moved with a stealth that would have shocked the men who called her an ox. She wasn't just strong, she was a creature of the mountains, and she knew how to walk unseen. She needed to find Thomas. They wouldn't keep him in the main house. A barn, maybe, or a storage shed. She scanned the outbuildings, looking for any sign of life. Her eyes landed on the ice house, a small, sturdy building, partially dug into the hillside, with a heavy, padlocked door. It was isolated from the other buildings, the perfect place to hold a prisoner. She moved toward it, keeping to the shadows. As she got closer, she heard voices. The 2 men from the night before, Scarface and his partner, were standing guard. Can't believe the boss wants to keep him alive, Scarface was saying, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. Should have just put a bullet in him and been done with it. The girl, the other man grunted. Boss is afraid of what she'll do if the boy just disappears. He wants to scare him off proper, make him sign a confession, then send him packing with a threat to never come back. Martha's hand went to the Colt at her hip. She could take them. She was confident of that. But the gunshots would bring every guard on the ranch running. She needed a distraction. Her gaze fell on the main horse corral, where a dozen of Blackwood's prize stallions were milling restlessly. A wicked smile touched her lips. She circled around, silent as a ghost, until she was behind the corral. With a few quick, powerful twists, she pulled 2 of the heavy rail posts free from the fence. It was enough. She let out a piercing whistle, then slapped the flank of the nearest stallion with all her might. The horse screamed and bolted, crashing through the weakened section of the fence. The rest of the herd, spooked by the sudden noise and movement, followed suit. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, running from the bunkhouse. Horses thundered across the yard in every direction. It was the perfect diversion. Scarface and his partner cursed, their attention torn between the escaping horses and their prisoner. "Stay here!" Scarface yelled, before taking off toward the stampede. That was the only opening Martha needed. She burst from the shadows, a charging force of nature. The remaining guard turned, his eyes wide with shock, but he was too slow. She didn't draw her gun. She didn't need to. She closed the distance in 3 long strides and slammed her fist into his jaw. He dropped like a sack of grain, out cold before he hit the ground. She grabbed the keys from his belt and fumbled with the padlock on the ice house door. It sprang open. Inside, it was dark and freezing. Thomas was huddled in a corner, his hands bound, a fresh bruise on his cheek. He looked up as the door opened, his eyes squinting against the sudden light. "Martha," he breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. "Get up, Cowboy," she said, her own voice thick with relief as she knelt to cut his ropes with her knife. "We're leaving." His hands were free. He rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving her face. "You came for me." "I told you," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Anything on my land is my business." He managed a weak smile. "I'm not on your land anymore." "You are now," she said, pressing James's Colt into his hand. "Can you use this?" He looked down at the gun, then back at her. His quiet demeanor hardened, replaced by a cold focus she'd never seen before. "I can." "Good," she said, "because we're not just leaving." Just then, a voice boomed across the yard, cutting through the chaos of the stampede. "Hold it right there!" Silas Blackwood stood on the porch of the main house, a hunting rifle in his hands. He was a big man, dressed in expensive clothes, with a face used to getting its way. Behind him, Scarface and a half-dozen other armed men were fanning out, their guns aimed at the ice house. They were trapped. "Well, well," Blackwood said with a smug sneer. "The Ox of Redstone Ridge. I should have known Dwyer would hide behind a woman's skirts, especially one as large as yours." Martha pushed Thomas behind her, shielding him with her body. "Your quarrel is with me, Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You murdered my husband." Blackwood actually laughed. "Your husband was a clumsy fool who died in an accident. You have no proof of anything." "I have his journal," she shot back. "And I have the original invoice from the lumberyard, the one Jedediah Miller is taking to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne as we speak." The smug look vanished from Blackwood's face. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, appeared in his eyes. "You're lying," he snarled. "Am I?" Martha said, her voice dripping with confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Why don't you ask your daughter, Elara? She knows you're a liar. She wrote Thomas a letter, told him how you framed him for theft." Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "You will not speak my daughter's name," he roared. He lifted his rifle, but before he could aim, a new voice cried out, "Father, no!" A young woman with fiery red hair burst out of the main house, running onto the porch, Elara Blackwood. She stood between her father and the yard, her arms spread wide. "Stop it," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Stop all of this. It's my fault. I love him, Father, and I know you lied about the necklace." Thomas stepped out from behind Martha, his eyes locked on Elara. The pain and love in his gaze were unmistakable. Blackwood was momentarily stunned by his daughter's defiance, and in that moment of hesitation, Martha saw her chance. But it wasn't a chance to fight. It was a chance to end it. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice calm and clear. "The marshal is coming. The whole territory will know what you did. You can start shooting, and maybe you'll kill us. But you can't kill the truth." Blackwood looked from Martha to Thomas to his weeping daughter. He saw his men hesitating, looking at each other, their loyalty wavering in the face of such a public and messy confrontation. His empire, built on fear and intimidation, was cracking. His face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He let out a primal scream of frustration and rage, swinging his rifle not at Martha or Thomas, but at the porch railing, smashing it to splinters. It was over. He was beaten. He dropped the rifle with a clatter, his shoulders slumping in defeat. His men lowered their weapons. Martha walked over to Thomas and took the Colt from his hand. She looked at him, then at Alara, who was now running down the steps toward him. She saw the way they looked at each other, the years of unspoken feelings passing between them in a single glance. A sharp, unexpected pain lanced through her chest. She had come here for him. She had risked everything for him. But she hadn't come for the shy cowboy who kissed her hand. She'd come for a man who belonged to someone else. She turned away before they could see the look on her face. She walked to the thicket where she'd left her horse, swung herself into the saddle, and rode away from Blackwood's ranch without a single look back. She had won. She had gotten justice for her husband. So why did it feel like she had just lost everything? The ride home was a blur. The righteous fire that had fueled her was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. She'd exposed a murderer, freed an innocent man, and faced down the most feared man in the territory. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she just felt empty. When she arrived back at her ranch, the place felt different, quieter, lonelier than it had in years. The silence she had once cherished now felt oppressive. The cabin, her sanctuary, felt like a cage. She unsaddled Iron, her movements mechanical. She walked into the cabin and saw the tin of salve still sitting on the mantel, a monument to a moment that felt like it had happened in another lifetime, to another woman. She had won justice for James. But who was left to share the victory with? She had saved Thomas, only to watch him walk back into the arms of the woman he truly loved. She had gone to war for him, and her reward was to be alone again. She sank into her rocking chair, the one he had knelt beside, and for the first time since she buried her husband, Martha Hale cried. She didn't cry for James. She didn't cry for justice. She cried for the gentle cowboy who had seen the grace in her calloused hands, and for the fool who had dared to hope, for just one night, that he might be hers. 2 days passed in a fog of silence and work. Martha threw herself into her chores with a ferocity that bordered on madness. She mended fences that weren't broken, scrubbed floors that were already clean, and chopped enough firewood to last through 2 more winters. She worked until her muscles screamed and her mind went blessedly blank. She tried not to think about him. She failed. Everywhere she looked, she saw him. By the hearth, in the barn, walking the ridge line. The memory of his quiet presence was a ghost that haunted every corner of her property. On the 3rd morning, she heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She told herself it was probably the sheriff, or a neighbor with news. She refused to let herself hope. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, her face a neutral mask. It was him. Thomas was riding up the path, leading a 2nd horse behind him. Not a fancy stallion from Blackwood stock, but a sturdy little mare. He stopped a few yards from the cabin and dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked different. The shadow of fear was gone from his eyes. He stood taller, straighter. But the gentleness was still there. Martha crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "What are you doing here, Dwyer? Shouldn't you be with your girl?" He had the decency to look down. "Alara. She's leaving. Going back east to live with her aunt. Her father's being taken to Cheyenne for trial. The marshal arrived yesterday. What you did, it worked. The whole valley is turning on him." "Good," Martha said, her voice clipped. "That's good." The silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. "She told me to thank you," Thomas finally said, looking up. "She said you were the strongest person she'd ever met." "I'm sure she did," Martha replied flatly. "Did you ride all the way out here just to deliver messages?" He took a hesitant step forward. "No, I came back for my things." He paused, and to see if the job was still open. Martha stared at him, stunned into silence. "The job? Why in God's name would you want to work here? You're a free man. You can go anywhere. I know, he said softly. Ilara, what we had was a long time ago. We were kids, dreaming of an escape. When I saw her again, I realized we're not those kids anymore. We're different people now. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. She's looking for a new start somewhere else, he said, his eyes searching hers. And I guess I am too. I thought maybe I'd already found it. Martha's heart was hammering against her ribs. She was afraid to believe him, afraid to hope again. I'm not an easy woman to be around, Thomas. I'm not looking for easy, he replied, his gaze unwavering. I'm looking for graceful, like the wind that bends the prairie grass, but never breaks. He recited his own words back to her, the words he had whispered to her sleeping form, and in the morning light they sounded less like a prayer and more like a vow. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. I thought I lost you, she whispered, her voice breaking. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached all the way to his eyes. You came for me, Martha. You rode into the lion's den for me. How could you ever lose me after that? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object, a ring. It was a plain silver band, slightly tarnished. This was my mother's. She told me I'd know when the time was right to give it to someone. He held it out to her. I think the time is right. Martha looked from the ring to his earnest, hopeful face. She saw her future there, a future that wasn't about being strong alone, but about being strong together. She walked down the steps, took his face in her rough, calloused hands, and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss full of relief and promise, of storms weathered and futures won. It was the kiss of a woman who had finally come home. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The wedding wasn't a grand affair. It was held right there on the ranch, in the field she had once plowed alone. The whole town came, not to whisper and stare, but to celebrate. Jedediah Miller stood as Thomas's best man. The sheriff, humbled and grateful, offered a toast. They weren't the ox and the drifter anymore. They were Martha and Thomas Dwyer, pillars of a community they had, in their own quiet way, saved. That night, as they lay under the familiar quilt in the quiet cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, he took her hand in his. The silver ring glinted in the firelight. You remember that first night? He asked, his voice a low murmur. She smiled in the darkness. When I pretended to sleep to see what you'd do? He nodded, kissing her fingers. I meant every word I said. I know, she whispered, her heart full. And I've kept every single one of them. The wind outside was calm, a gentle sigh across the plains, and inside, two hearts that had been forced to live in silence for far too long finally beat loud and strong and free. So if you ever feel like the world sees you as one thing, when you know you're something else entirely, just remember the story of Martha and Thomas. Remember that true strength isn't always loud, and true grace isn't always soft, and sometimes the person who truly sees you is waiting just on the other side of a little test. If you enjoyed their story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are always more stories out there, just waiting to be told.